The intersection of Dexter Avenue and 9th Street was the kind of corner that had seen enough over the years that the people who lived near it had developed a specific relationship with the sound of tires and impact, a relationship that was more recognition than surprise, the way you recognize a word in a language you did not know you had learned. The traffic light at that corner had a 2-second delay between the green on Dexter and the green on 9th, that most drivers who used the intersection daily had absorbed into their driving without thinking about it, and that occasional drivers had not. On a Thursday afternoon in October at 3:45, the driver of a gray sedan on 9th Street had not. Marcus Green heard the impact before he saw it. He was half a block south on Dexter Avenue, walking home from school with his backpack on both shoulders and his hands in his jacket pockets because it was a bad day. Not the worst kind, but the kind where the shaking started if he let his hands hang free, and he had learned to manage the telling of his body against his wishes by managing what his body was doing when other people could see it. He heard the sound and looked up and saw the gray sedan sideways across the intersection, with the front end of a delivery truck buried in the passenger side. And he saw the smoke before he fully understood what the smoke meant. And then he saw the small orange beginning of something under the crumpled hood of the sedan, and he understood. He dropped his backpack on the sidewalk. He did not decide to drop it. His hands simply let it go, and his body was already moving before his mind had finished processing what his body had decided. He crossed the distance between himself and the intersection at a run, and the smoke was thicker by the time he reached the car, and the orange under the hood had become something more committed, and he could feel the heat on his face from 6 feet away. The driver of the sedan was conscious and already out on the driver's side, standing on the road with her hands on the roof of the car, and her face doing something that had not yet become the expression it was going to become when she fully understood what was happening. Marcus went to the passenger side. The passenger window was cracked, but not gone, and inside he could see a boy, younger than him, small, with dark hair and his head against the headrest at an angle that meant he was not fully conscious, but was not gone either. The passenger door was compressed inward from the truck's impact and was not going to open, and Marcus knew this without trying it because the geometry of the crumpled metal said it plainly to anyone who was looking at it with the right kind of attention. He took his jacket off and wrapped it around his right elbow and put the elbow through the cracked window and cleared the remaining glass out of the frame, and then put both hands on the window frame and leaned in. The boy stirred when Marcus touched his shoulder. He made a sound that was not words, and his eyes opened partially, and Marcus told him in a low, steady voice that he needed to come toward him, and that Marcus was going to help him, and that he needed to put his arms up. The boy looked at him with the specific, unfocused look of someone whose body and mind have not yet agreed on what is happening, and Marcus said his name, not knowing his name, and using the word son the way adults used it, the way he had heard men use it when they needed someone to pay attention immediately and completely. And the boy's eyes sharpened slightly, and he raised his arms. Marcus got his hands under the boy's arms and pulled, and the boy came toward the window, and Marcus moved his weight backward, and the boy came through the window frame, with Marcus guiding his head. And then they were both on the road, and Marcus had his arm under the boy's back and was moving away from the car. He got the boy to the curb in front of the church on the northeast corner of the intersection and set him down on the sidewalk with his back against the low stone wall that ran along the front of the property, and checked him the way his mother had taught him to check things. Hands first, then arms, then the boy's head and face, looking for something wrong, and finding a burn on the left forearm that was going to need attention, and a cut above the left eyebrow that was bleeding in the way of head cuts, more than the injury warranted, and that Marcus pressed his own sleeve against. The boy looked at him. His eyes were clearer now. He asked Marcus his name, and Marcus told him, and the boy said his name was Caleb, and Marcus told him that was good and to keep his eyes open. The crowd had gathered the way crowds gather at accidents, quickly and in a ring, and Marcus could hear sirens from the direction of 5th Street, And he looked at Caleb and saw that Caleb was conscious, and that the bleeding was slowing, and that the burn on his arm was the kind that hurt but was not the kind that did the deeper damage. And he looked at the crowd around them, and at the people with their phones out, and at the way the light was beginning to come from the wrong direction as the afternoon moved. And he stood up. He told Caleb to stay still, and that the ambulance was coming. And Caleb looked at him with the eyes of someone who has just understood that the person in front of them is about to leave, and who does not know how to ask them to stay. Marcus told him he was going to be all right, and he said it the way he said most things, without decoration, as a statement of what was true rather than what was comforting. And then he stepped back into the crowd, and the crowd closed around him the way crowds do. And when the first ambulance pulled onto Dexter Avenue 30 seconds later, Marcus Green was not there. His backpack was still on the sidewalk half a block south where he had dropped it. It sat on the concrete with one strap twisted under it and the front pocket facing up with the name tag visible through the small plastic window on the front. The tag his mother had written his name on in black marker at the beginning of 7th grade, and which had survived 2 years of daily use with the name still legible: Marcus Green, Room 14, Dexter Avenue. Someone picked the backpack up before the evening was over and put it in the lost and found box in the lobby of the church on the northeast corner of the intersection, the same church whose low stone wall Caleb Riker had been leaning against when Marcus pressed his sleeve against the cut above Caleb's eyebrow and told him in a plain and steady voice that he was going to be all right. The backpack sat in the lost and found box through Thursday night and into Friday morning with the name tag facing up and Marcus's name visible to anyone who looked, and one person eventually did. Marcus Green woke at 6 every morning regardless of what the previous day had cost him. This was not a choice he remade each morning, but a fact about him. The same way the disease was a fact about him, something that existed independent of his preferences, and that he had built his days around without making it the center of those days. He dressed quietly because the apartment on Dexter Avenue had thin walls, and Carol worked the restaurant shift until 11 and was usually asleep until 7. And he had learned the specific geography of the floorboards between his bedroom and the kitchen well enough to navigate it in the dark without sound. The apartment was on the 4th floor of a building that was clean and maintained in the specific way of buildings where the people who lived in them took care of what was theirs, because what was theirs was all there was. Carol kept it the way she kept most things, with a practical attention that had no room in it for anything decorative, but that produced a space that felt considered rather than sparse. Marcus had a desk in his room with his school books arranged in the order he used them, and a lamp that he had rewired himself after it stopped working, because throwing it out and buying another one was not a calculation that came out in favor of throwing it out. The disease had a name that was long and that Marcus did not use with people who did not already know it. He called it the condition when he had to refer to it at all, which was as rarely as possible. And on the days it was making itself known, he called it a bad day, which was as specific as he was willing to be in front of anyone. The shaking in his hands was the most visible symptom, and the most manageable with the right treatment, and the one he had not been able to get for 8 months because the right treatment cost $20,000, and $20,000 was a number that existed in a different category from the numbers that moved through the Green household on a monthly basis. He knew this not because Carol had told him, but because he had found the hospital paperwork in the kitchen drawer in April, and had read it and put it back exactly as he found it, and had not said anything about it to his mother since. Carol left for the records office at 8:15 every weekday morning, and came home at 5 and left again for the restaurant at 6 and came home at 11, and did all of this with the specific economy of someone who has arranged their life into the smallest shape that will still contain everything necessary. She told Marcus she liked the restaurant job, that it kept her moving, that the people were good. Marcus listened to this and did not say what he knew about why she had taken it, because saying it would have meant admitting he had found the paperwork, and admitting that would have meant Carol could no longer protect him from it. And protecting him from it was something she needed to do, and he understood that need even if he did not share it. He walked to school on Dexter Avenue every morning past the church on the corner and past the intersection at 9th Street and past the small repair shop that had been closed for 2 years and past the vacant lot where something had been promised for 4 years and not yet arrived. He noticed these things the way you notice the furniture of a place you have lived long enough that the noticing is automatic and below the level of conscious thought. He noticed also the days his hands were steady and the days they were not, and on the days they were not, he kept them in his pockets and walked the same route at the same pace and gave nothing away to anyone he passed. On Wednesday evening, the week before the accident, he updated his school planner at his desk under the rewired lamp and looked at the week ahead and looked at his hands resting on the desk, steady that evening, and thought about the paperwork in the kitchen drawer and about the $4,000 on the fundraiser page his mother did not know he had found, and about the specific arithmetic of the distance between 4,000 and 20,000. He closed the planner and turned off the lamp and went to bed and was up at 6 the next morning and walked to school on Dexter Avenue and came home on the same route in the afternoon with his backpack on both shoulders and his hands in his pockets, because Thursday was a bad day, and he did not know yet that it was about to become something else entirely. Danny Riker had been a member of the Iron Cross chapter for 17 years and a father for 11, and the two facts had shaped each other in ways he had not anticipated when either of them began. He had assumed when Caleb was born that fatherhood would exist in a separate compartment from the chapter, that he would be one thing in one place and another thing in another, and that the two would not require reconciliation. He had been wrong about that in the specific way you are wrong about things you assumed without examining, and the wrongness had produced something better than what he had planned, which was a boy who knew exactly who his father was and who his father's people were, and who was not afraid of either. Caleb had his father's deliberate quality and his mother's curiosity, his mother having left when Caleb was 3 in the way of people who discover that the life they have chosen does not fit the person they actually are. And Danny had raised Caleb alone since then with the same practical attention he brought to everything that mattered to him. He did not explain the chapter to Caleb as something separate from ordinary life because it was not separate from ordinary life. It was how certain things got done, and certain people got looked after, and certain situations got resolved that would otherwise go unresolved. And Caleb had grown up understanding this the way children understand things that are simply present in their environment from the beginning. On Thursday afternoon, Caleb had stayed late at school for a science project and was walking home on 9th Street at 3:45, a route he took twice a week. And he was thinking about the project and not about the intersection ahead of him when he heard the sound of the impact and felt the air change the way air changes when something large and fast has suddenly stopped being either. He was in the passenger seat of the sedan because his friend's mother had offered him a ride and he had accepted it, and the friend's mother was the woman who came out on the driver's side, and the car was the gray sedan, and the boy against the headrest was Caleb. He remembered the window breaking. He remembered the cold air coming through the frame and a voice that was low and steady and that told him to put his arms up and that used the word sun in a way that made him pay attention despite everything his body was doing to prevent him from paying attention to anything. He remembered being moved and the heat and then the cold stone of the church wall against his back and a hand pressing something against his forehead and a face above him that he could not fully resolve into features because his eyes were not cooperating yet. He remembered the name Marcus because he had asked, and because the name had been given without hesitation and without the performance of calm that people put on when they are afraid and trying not to show it. The calm had been actual. Danny arrived at the hospital at 4:30 after Rick called him, and he sat beside Caleb's bed for 2 hours and listened to Caleb tell him what he remembered. Caleb told it in pieces, the way you tell things that happened while you are not fully present for them, assembling the pieces in the order they became available, rather than the order they occurred. Danny listened without interrupting, and when Caleb finished, Danny asked him one question. He asked if the boy had said anything else before he left. Caleb thought about it, and told his father that the boy had said he was going to be all right, and that the way he said it was different from the way people usually said things like that. Danny asked him how it was different. Caleb said it sounded like he meant it as a fact rather than a hope. Danny looked at his son for a moment, and then looked at the burn on Caleb's left forearm, minor, already treated, and rubbed his thumb slowly across the scar on his own right forearm, the way he did when he was working through something that had more dimensions than its surface suggested. Rick arrived at the hospital at 6, and Danny told him what Caleb had said, and Rick took out his small spiral notebook and wrote in it with the mechanical pencil from behind his ear. He asked Danny if Caleb had gotten a name. Danny told him Marcus, no last name, 14 approximately, lean, dark jacket. Rick wrote this down and told Danny he would start in the morning. Danny said he knew, and that was the end of that conversation because there was nothing else to decide until Rick had more. Reverend Thomas Aldridge was on the steps of the church on the northeast corner of Dexter Avenue and 9th Street when the accident happened, and he saw the whole of it from 30 feet away. He was 62 years old and had been at that church for 27 years and had watched Dexter Avenue from those steps in every season and in most weathers, and had seen enough on that corner to have built a specific and complicated relationship with what he expected from it. He watched the boy drop his backpack and run to the burning car, and he watched what the boy did at the passenger window, and he watched the boy carry Caleb to the wall of his church, and he watched the boy press his own sleeve against the cut, and he watched the crowd gather, and he watched the boy stand and step back into the crowd and disappear. He stood on the steps for a moment after the ambulances arrived, and the crowd began to disperse. And then he went inside and picked up the backpack that someone had placed in the lost and found box in the lobby, and looked at the name tag in the front pocket window. Marcus Green, room 14, Dexter Avenue. He knew the building. He knew most buildings on Dexter Avenue the way a man knows the street he has walked every day for 27 years. Not the interiors, but the exteriors, and the people who came in and out of them, and the general shape of the lives those people were living. He did not know Marcus specifically. He placed the backpack back in the lost and found box and stood in the lobby for a moment, and then went to his office and sat at his desk and opened his worn leather Bible to no particular page, and sat with it in his hands without reading it, the way he sat with it when what he needed from it was not words, but weight. Rick found the name on Friday morning. He went to the church first because the backpack had to have come from somewhere close to the accident, and churches on busy corners were where things left behind on sidewalks tended to end up. Reverend Aldridge came to the door and looked at Rick and the vest with the careful neutrality of a man who had been dealing with uninvited people for 27 years, and who had developed a protocol for receiving them that revealed nothing prematurely. Rick told him who he was and why he was there, and Aldridge listened and went to the lobby and came back with the backpack and handed it over without comment. Rick looked at the name tag and wrote the name and the address in his notebook and handed the backpack back and thanked him. Aldridge told him the boy had done a brave thing. Rick said he knew and went back to his truck. He spent Friday afternoon and Monday building the picture. By Tuesday morning, it was complete enough that he sat with Danny in the garage and told it straight through without commentary because the facts did not need it. 14 years old, single-parent household. Mother named Carol Green, working days at the county records office and evenings at Rosario's restaurant on 5th Street for the past 8 months. A fundraising page targeting $20,000 with a current total of $4,200 and a description naming a condition that Rick summarized for Danny as a disease manageable with the right treatment that cost $20,000. The fundraiser had been active for 8 months and had stalled. Perfect school attendance, no disciplinary history. Neighbors described the boy in terms that were consistent and specific, the kind of kid you noticed because of what he did not do. Danny listened without moving. When Rick finished, Danny was quiet long enough that the coffee on the filing cabinet finished its cycle and clicked off. Then he said they were going Tuesday evening, and Rick said he knew. They arrived at the building on Dexter Avenue at 6:30, Danny and Rick, without the others, because Danny had decided 2 was the right number for a first conversation and that more would change the temperature before anything got said. Carol Green answered the door in her records office clothes with her restaurant apron over her arm. She looked at the vests, and her expression processed several possibilities without settling on one. Danny told her his name and told her his son was Caleb, and that her son had pulled Caleb from a burning car, and that he was there because a debt existed, and he did not carry debts. Carol looked at him for a moment and opened the door. The kitchen table had 4 chairs and a plastic tablecloth, and at the far end a dark jacket hung over a chair back with a small burn mark on the right sleeve where Marcus had used it to clear the window glass. Danny saw it, and Carol saw him see it, and something moved across her face that she brought back under control before it completed itself. She told them to sit and put water on, and stood at the counter with her back to them for a moment before she turned around. Marcus came out of his room at the sound of voices. He stood in the kitchen doorway in a plain gray shirt with his hands visible at his sides and looked at Danny and Rick and the vests, and then at his mother. Carol told him who they were, and Marcus came to the table and sat across from Danny and took stock of the situation with the specific, unhurried attention of someone who had learned that the first reading of a room was the most important one. Danny told him directly that Caleb had described what Marcus had done in enough detail that Danny understood it fully, and that Caleb was recovering well, and that the burn on his arm was minor. Marcus received this with a brief nod that communicated what it needed to without performing it. Danny told him he owed him something, and that he was not a man who left debts unpaid. Marcus told him he did not consider it a debt. Danny said he knew, and that the debt existed regardless. Carol brought tea to the table, and Danny asked her if he could ask about the fundraiser. Her hands tightened on the cup and then released, and she looked at Marcus and then at Danny and said yes. Danny asked how long the treatment had been out of reach. 8 months, she said. He asked the current total. She told him, and her voice stayed even. Danny looked at Marcus and asked if he knew about the fundraiser. Marcus looked at his mother first and then said yes. Carol set her cup down carefully and looked at her son. Marcus told her he had found the paperwork in April and had been trying to find the right way to tell her and had not found it yet. Carol looked at Marcus for a long moment, and Marcus looked back, and the thing that passed between them in that silence was not something Danny or Rick needed to name or interrupt. Danny told them the chapter wanted to help, and that the help would be specific and practical, and would not arrive and then leave, and that he understood if they needed time. Carol asked what specific and practical meant. Danny said it meant the fundraiser was going to be rebuilt and relaunched with the chapter's full network behind it, and that there were other things he wanted to discuss when they were ready, and that nothing would happen without their knowledge and agreement. Carol looked at her tea, and then at Marcus, and then at Danny, and told him they would like to hear more. Rick opened his notebook and uncapped his pencil, and the kitchen was quiet in the way of a room where something important has just been agreed to, and where everyone present understands the agreement is a beginning. Danny came back on Thursday evening alone. He had thought about whether to bring Rick and had decided against it because what Thursday needed was a conversation rather than a meeting. And conversations happened differently when the number of people in the room stayed small. Carol was home from the records office and not yet gone to the restaurant, and she let him in, and Marcus was at his desk in his room with the door open, And Danny sat at the kitchen table, and Carol sat across from him, and they talked for 40 minutes while Marcus did his homework and did not come out, and did not need to, because the walls were thin and he could hear everything. And all three of them understood this, and nobody acknowledged it. Danny asked Carol to tell him about the treatment. Not the cost, which he already knew, but the treatment itself, what it did and how it worked, and what Marcus's days looked like with it versus without it. Carol told him. She told him about the inflammation and what it did to the muscles, and about the shaking in his hands, which was the visible part, and about the fatigue, which was the invisible part, and which was worse than the visible part, because fatigue was something Marcus could hide, and did hide, and the hiding of it cost him more than the fatigue itself. She told Danny that the treatment would not cure the disease, but would manage it to the point where it was a fact about Marcus's life, rather than the organizing principle of it, and that the difference between those two things was the difference between a life that had room in it and a life that did not. Danny listened to all of this without writing anything down and without asking questions until she was finished, and then he asked one question. He asked her when she had last had a full Saturday off. Carol looked at him and then at the table and told him she could not remember exactly and that it had been some time in the spring. Danny nodded and did not say anything else about it, and Carol understood that he had heard what she had not said as clearly as what she had said, and she looked at her hands on the table and then back at him. She asked him what the chapter was actually going to do. Danny told her the fundraiser first. He said Rick had already been in contact with 3 organizations the chapter worked with regularly, and that those organizations had networks, and that networks moved money differently from individual donors, and that he expected the fundraiser to look different within 2 weeks. Carol asked him how different. Danny told her he expected it to reach the target. Carol looked at him in the specific way of someone who has been hoping for something for 8 months, and who has learned to be careful about hope, because hope has a cost when it does not arrive, and she had already paid that cost once. She told him she wanted to believe that, and that she was having some difficulty with the believing. Danny told her that was reasonable, and that she did not have to believe it yet, and that the believing would come from the watching, and that the watching was what he was asking her to do for now. He also told her about the restaurant. He said he knew someone who knew Bev, the manager at Rosario's, and that there was a possibility of Carol's hours being restructured in a way that did not reduce her income, but reduced the number of evenings she was away. Carol looked at him for a long moment and told him that she was not comfortable with people arranging her employment without her knowledge, and her voice was polite and clear, and Danny told her she was right, and that nothing would be done without her explicit agreement, and that he had raised it as a possibility rather than a plan. Carol told him she appreciated the distinction. Danny said he knew she did. Marcus came to the doorway of his room at 7:30. He stood there in his gray shirt with his hands in his pockets, a bad day, and looked at Danny at the kitchen table, and Danny looked back at him and did not look at his pockets. Marcus asked Danny if he could ask him something. Danny said yes. Marcus asked him why the chapter was doing this and what they expected to get from it. Danny looked at him for a moment. He told Marcus that Caleb had been in a burning car and was alive, and that the reason he was alive was the boy standing in the doorway, and that when Danny tried to imagine his life without that being true, he found he could not imagine it, and that he was not a man who let a debt of that size go unpaid because it was inconvenient or complicated to pay. Marcus looked at him and told him that he still did not consider it a debt. Danny told him he had heard that and that it did not change anything. Marcus looked at his mother and then back at Danny and told him he had another question. Danny said, "Go ahead." Marcus asked him whether the chapter was going to still be there in 6 months. The question sat in the kitchen for a moment, with the specific weight of a question that has been formed over a long time and is being asked for the first time. Danny told Marcus to look at him, and Marcus looked at him, and Danny told him yes. The chapter meeting happened on Friday evening at the garage. Danny stood at the workbench and told the chapter what he had told Carol: the disease and the treatment and the cost and the second job and the fundraiser that had stalled at $4,000. And then he told them about Marcus, about the window and the jacket sleeve and the burn on the right arm, and about a 14-year-old who had kept his hands in his pockets for 8 months so that his mother would not see the shaking and worry more than she was already worrying. The garage was quiet when he finished. Boone, who said very little, looked at the floor and then looked up and said that they were going to fix this, and that was the only comment that needed to be made, and nobody added to it. Rick had the restructured fundraiser page live by Saturday morning. He had spent Thursday and Friday contacting the organizations and 3 chapter members in neighboring states whose networks covered different donor pools, and by Saturday afternoon, the fundraiser had received 14 new contributions, and the total had moved from 4,200 to 6,800. Rick called Danny and told him the number, and Danny called Carol and told her. And Carol was quiet on the phone for a long time, and then she told him thank you in the voice of someone who has been holding something very carefully for a very long time and has just been told they can put it down. Marcus was in his room when Carol came to the doorway and told him the fundraiser number. He was at his desk with his school planner open, and he looked at her, and she told him the number, and he looked at it for a moment, and then looked at his hands on the desk, which were not steady that evening, and he put them flat on the surface and left them there, and looked at his mother standing in the doorway, and neither of them said anything for a while, because the number was doing all the talking that needed doing, and they both knew it. The fundraiser reached $11,000 by the following Friday. Rick did not announce this to anyone outside the chapter until he had confirmed the number twice, because he had learned across many years of finding things that the first number was sometimes optimistic, and that the second number was the one worth saying out loud. He called Danny on Friday evening, and Danny drove to the green apartment and knocked, and Carol answered in her restaurant apron, and Danny told her the number, and she leaned against the doorframe and looked at the hallway ceiling for a moment before she looked back at him. She told him she was going to be late for her shift. Danny told her Bev already knew and had told Carol to take the evening. Carol looked at him and told him she had said she needed to be consulted before anything was arranged with her employer. Danny told her she was right, and that he had asked Rick to reach out to Bev as a possibility, and that Bev had made her own decision, and that he could not fully control what Bev decided once the conversation happened. Carol looked at him for a long time. Then she said she was going to let it go this once, and that next time she meant what she said. And Danny told her he understood, and that there would not be a next time without her explicit agreement. Carol stepped back from the door and told him to come in. Marcus was at the kitchen table with his homework spread across the surface, and he looked up when Danny came in, and then at his mother and read her face accurately enough to know that the news was good before either of them said anything. Carol told him the number, and Marcus looked at it for a moment and then looked at his hands on the table. They were steadier than the previous Thursday, and he did not put them in his pockets, and Danny noticed this and said nothing about it. Danny sat down and Carol made coffee, and the 3 of them sat at the kitchen table in the ordinary way of people who have moved past the first formality of a situation and arrived somewhere more functional. Danny told them he wanted to talk about something else, something separate from the fundraiser, and that it involved Marcus specifically. Carol looked at him, and Marcus looked at him, and Danny told Marcus that a member of the chapter named Curtis, who was 61 years old and who had been rebuilding engines since before Marcus was born, had a project in the garage that he had been putting off for 2 years, and that Curtis had told Danny he would be willing to share the project with someone who was interested in learning, and that Danny thought Marcus might be that person if Marcus was interested. Marcus looked at him and asked what the project was. Danny told him a 1963 Harley-Davidson Panhead, that 63 Harley-Davidson Panhead that had been sitting partially disassembled in the corner of the garage since Curtis acquired it, and that Curtis's patience with its current state was running out, and that the engine alone was going to take several months of Saturday mornings to address properly. Marcus asked why Curtis wanted to share it. Danny told him Curtis was 61 and that his knees made the floor work difficult, and that he needed someone who could get to the parts of the engine that required being closer to the ground than Curtis found comfortable. Marcus looked at this answer for a moment from several angles, and then said he was interested. Carol asked Danny later, after Marcus had gone back to his room, whether the engine project was something Marcus needed or something Danny had invented to give Marcus something that was his rather than something done for him. Danny told her it was both, and that Curtis's knees were a genuine problem, and that the engine was genuinely in the corner of the garage, and that the two things did not cancel each other out. Carol held her coffee cup and looked at him, and told him that was a careful answer. Danny said he was a careful man. Carol almost smiled and looked at her cup, and then told him that Marcus had been defined by the disease for 3 years in his own mind, and that what he needed more than the treatment was something that had nothing to do with the disease, and that if the engine was real, she was glad, and that if it was partly invented, she was still glad, and that Danny could tell Curtis she said thank you. Danny told her he would. Reverend Aldridge had been watching the green apartment building from the street for 2 weeks. Not standing outside watching, which would have been conspicuous and which was not how he operated, but noticing the truck that appeared on Tuesday and Thursday evenings and the men who went in and came out, and the specific quality of purposeful activity that had a different texture from the occasional activity that surrounded most buildings on Dexter Avenue. He had not spoken to Carol Green about it because Carol was not a regular member of his congregation, and because approaching people about their private business without being invited was not something he did, regardless of how long he had been their neighbor. He had spoken to 3 people who were regular members of his congregation and who lived in the building or adjacent to it, and what they told him was consistent. The men from the chapter were coming by. The fundraiser for the Green Boy had moved significantly. Someone had spoken to Rosario's about Carol's hours. The Reverend received all of this information and sat with it in his office with his worn leather Bible in his hands and thought about what he knew about the chapter from the previous 27 years and what he knew about Dexter Avenue and about what happened to this street when outside attention arrived and then left, and about the specific kind of damage that the leaving did, which was worse than the original problem because it arrived on top of hope. He wrote in his sermon notes on Friday evening. He wrote about the difference between attention and presence, and then stopped and looked at what he had written and crossed out attention and wrote the word interest instead, because interest was more accurate to what he had observed from the outside, and he was a man who preferred the accurate word, even when it was less dramatic. He did not deliver the sermon that Sunday. He put it in the drawer of his desk and closed the drawer and went to lead the service with the sermon he had already prepared, and in the middle of the prepared sermon, he stopped for a moment that his congregation noticed and that he acknowledged with a slight nod before he continued, as though he had heard something he was not yet ready to respond to out loud. On Saturday morning, Marcus went to the chapter garage for the first time. Danny had told him Curtis would be there at 9, and Marcus had told his mother where he was going, and Carol had said, "All right," with the specific quality of a parent who has made a decision to let something happen and is holding the decision in place with both hands. Marcus walked to Randolph Street and found the side door open, and went in and stood in the threshold the way he always stood in new spaces and took inventory. Curtis was at the back of the garage, beside a workbench with a motorcycle engine in pieces on the surface in front of him, and he looked up when Marcus came in and told him to come over, and Marcus went over and stood beside him and looked at the engine, and Curtis pointed at a specific component and asked Marcus if he knew what he was looking at. Marcus told him he did not. Curtis told him good, and that they were going to start from the beginning then, and that starting from the beginning was always better than starting from the middle. And Marcus picked up the component Curtis indicated and turned it over in his hands, and his hands were steady that Saturday morning, and he did not think about whether they were steady, because the engine was more interesting than the question. The fundraiser reached $17,000 on a Tuesday in November. Rick watched the number move across 3 days with the specific patience of someone who has set something in motion and understands that watching it does not make it move faster, but who watches anyway, because the watching is its own form of participation. He texted Danny the number without commentary, and Danny read it at the garage workbench and put his phone in his pocket and went back to what he was working on, and did not call Carol, because he had decided that the call he wanted to make was the one where the number was 20,000 and not before. Marcus had been to the garage 4 Saturdays in a row. Curtis had established a rhythm with him that operated below the level of instruction and felt more like demonstration and observation. Curtis showing and Marcus watching, and then Marcus doing and Curtis watching, and neither of them talking more than the work required. Marcus had learned the names of the panhead's major components and had cleaned and cataloged the disassembled parts and had asked 3 questions across 4 Saturdays that Curtis had answered in the direct economy of someone who respected a question that had been thought through before it was asked. On the 4th Saturday, Curtis told Danny after Marcus left that the boy had good hands. Danny asked if the shaking was a problem. Curtis said he had not noticed any shaking. Danny said that was good, and Curtis said it was better than good, and went back to his coffee. Reverend Aldridge had his first conversation with Danny on a Tuesday morning in November. It happened outside the church on the Dexter Avenue steps, and it was not something either of them had planned. Danny had parked his truck on Dexter to check in on a chapter member who lived 2 buildings north and was coming back to his truck when Aldridge came out of the church and they looked at each other across the short distance of the sidewalk, and Aldridge said good morning, and Danny said good morning, and then neither of them moved, and the conversation began in the specific way of conversations between 2 people who have been aware of each other from a distance and have arrived at the point where the distance has become more work than closing it. Aldridge asked Danny directly how long the chapter intended to be involved on Dexter Avenue. Danny told him as long as it took. Aldridge asked what that meant in practical terms. Danny told him it meant until the treatment was funded and Carol was working 1 job and Marcus had what he needed to get through the next year, and that after that, it meant whatever Marcus and Carol said it meant, because it was their lives and not the chapter's. Aldridge looked at him and asked him whether he understood what happened to this street when people came in with good intentions and then found something more pressing to attend to. Danny told him he understood it better than Aldridge might expect, and that he was not going to stand on the sidewalk and promise Aldridge something he could not guarantee, and that the only evidence he had to offer was what the chapter had already done and what it continued to do, and that Aldridge would have to make his own judgment from that. Aldridge looked at him for a long time. He said that was a more honest answer than he had anticipated. Danny said he tried to be accurate. Aldridge told him he would be watching, and Danny told him that was fine and got in his truck. He sat in the truck for a moment before he started it and looked at the church steps where Aldridge had been standing. He thought about what Aldridge had said about good intentions and the street, and he thought about the specific weight of 27 years of watching a neighborhood get discovered and abandoned, and what that did to a man's relationship with hope. And he thought that if he had been standing on those steps for 27 years, he would have said the same thing in the same tone, and probably less diplomatically. He started the truck and drove to the garage. Carol had her first full Saturday off in 9 months on the second weekend of November. She did not know what to do with it initially, which was its own kind of information about what 8 months of double shifts did to a person's understanding of their own time. She made breakfast at a pace that was unfamiliar to her, slowly, without the background calculation of what needed to happen next and when. And Marcus sat at the kitchen table and watched her, and did not comment on the pace, because commenting would have required acknowledging that the pace was different from usual, and acknowledging that would have required explaining why, and they were both still finding their way toward the direct version of that conversation. She made eggs and toast, and they ate at the table together in the late morning light coming through the kitchen window, and the radio was on, and neither of them said much, and the not saying much was the good kind. Marcus told her about the panhead on Saturday morning after breakfast. He had not told her the details of the Saturday garage sessions beyond the basic fact of them, and she had not pushed for details because she understood that the sessions were his, and that his was something he needed them to be. But that Saturday, he told her about the engine, and about Curtis, and about the specific problem with the primary chain that he and Curtis had identified on the previous Saturday, and that they were going to address the following week. Carol listened and asked questions that were genuine rather than performative, about the engine and how it worked and what the primary chain did and what fixing it required, and Marcus answered them with the ease of someone who has found a subject they know well enough to explain and who is discovering the pleasure of that for the first time. Carol watched his hands while he talked. They were on the table, and they were steady, and she looked at them and then at her son's face and looked back at her coffee. Danny came by on Thursday evening and sat at the kitchen table and told Carol that a woman named Bev at Rosario's had asked him to pass along that the evening shift was available to Carol if she wanted it, and that if she did not want it, that was also fine, and that Bev had asked him to make clear that the decision was entirely Carol's. Carol looked at him and asked him whether Bev had reached out to him or he had reached out to Bev. Danny told her Bev had called him. Carol considered this, and then said she would take 2 evenings a week instead of 4, and that 2 was what she needed, and 4 was what the situation had required, and that the situation had changed. Danny told her that sounded right. Carol told him she was going to keep the records office job regardless, because she had been there for 7 years, and because it was hers in a way that had nothing to do with money, and Danny said he understood that, and that nobody had suggested otherwise. He drove home after and sat in the garage at his workbench without turning the main lights on, just the small lamp above the bench throwing its yellow circle across the surface. He thought about Caleb asleep upstairs and about the burn on Caleb's left forearm that was healed now and barely visible, and about a 14-year-old boy who had gone through a car window on a Thursday afternoon because the alternative had not presented itself as an option, and who was now sitting across a panhead engine on Saturday mornings with hands that did not shake and a mind that asked the right questions, and who had told Danny on his first Saturday that he did not know what he was looking at, and who now knew considerably more than that. Danny turned off the lamp and went upstairs. The fundraiser reached $20,000 on a Friday afternoon in the 3rd week of November. Rick had been watching the number for 4 days as it moved through 18 and 19,000 in the incremental way of something that is almost finished and that the almost makes feel longer than the whole journey that preceded it. When the total crossed 20,000, he sat in his truck in the Chapter garage parking lot and looked at the number on his phone for a moment, and then called Danny. Danny answered on the second ring, and Rick told him the number, and Danny was quiet for long enough that Rick checked the call was still connected, and then Danny said, "Good," and told Rick to take the rest of the day. Rick said he was going to, and hung up. Danny called Carol at the records office. She answered in the professional voice of someone at their desk, And when Danny told her the number, her professional voice stopped being professional, and she said nothing for a moment, and Danny held the phone and waited. She told him she needed a minute, and he said he knew, and she put the phone down, and he could hear her breathing. And then she came back and told him, "Thank you," in a voice that was not the voice she used when she meant the courtesy version of thank you. Danny told her Rick had done most of the work, and that the chapter network had done the rest, and that all he had done was make a phone call. And she told him that the phone call was the thing, and that he knew that. And he said he did. Caleb found out before Marcus did. He had been following the fundraiser on his phone every day since Rick relaunched it, because Danny had shown him the page in the first week and told him this was what you did when someone did something for you and you wanted to do something back. And Caleb had understood this as instruction rather than suggestion, and had checked the number every day before school and sometimes after. When it crossed 20,000 on Friday afternoon, Caleb was at his desk doing homework, and he put his homework down and picked up his phone and called Marcus. Marcus answered from the grocery store where he was covering a Friday shift, and Caleb told him the number, and Marcus went quiet the way his mother had gone quiet when Danny called her. The same quality of silence, which made sense because it was the same silence, the silence of something you have been carrying for long enough that the putting down of it has its own specific weight. Caleb told him he had been watching the number every day. Marcus told him he did not know that. Caleb said he knew Marcus did not know and that he had been doing it anyway. Marcus told him he would call him later and hung up and went to the back of the store and stood at the utility sink and looked at his hands under the running water for a moment before he dried them and went back to the floor. He finished the shift and walked home on Dexter Avenue and stopped outside the church on the corner and looked at the steps where he had set Caleb down against the low stone wall 7 weeks ago. The wall was the same gray stone, and the steps were the same worn concrete, and the light above the church door was on against the November evening, and Reverend Aldridge was visible through the window of his office on the ground floor, a shape behind glass bent over something on his desk. Marcus stood on the sidewalk and looked at the church for a moment, and then walked home. Carol was at the kitchen table when he came in. She had come home from the records office and had not gone to Rosario's because it was not one of her 2 evenings, and she was sitting at the table with a cup of tea and her hands around it, and her face carrying the specific quality of someone who has been sitting with something important and who has not yet decided what to do with the sitting. She looked at Marcus when he came in, and he looked at her, and she said, "Caleb called you." Marcus said he knew, and sat down across from her, and they looked at each other across the kitchen table the way they had been looking at each other for 8 months, across the things they had not been saying. And then Carol told him she was sorry he had carried the paperwork alone since April, and Marcus told her he was sorry she had carried the second job alone for 8 months before that. And they sat with those 2 sorrows on the table between them for a moment, and then Carol reached across and put her hand over his, and his hands were still. Reverend Aldridge wrote the sermon on Saturday morning. He had been writing toward it for 3 weeks, drafting and crossing out and drafting again, and on Saturday it came out in one sitting at his desk with his worn leather Bible open in front of him and his wife's name visible in the front cover in her handwriting, the way it always was. He wrote about presence versus attention, and about what it looked like when a community received something real versus something performed, and how the difference was visible in the specific behavior of the people offering it, rather than in what they said about themselves. He wrote about a boy who had dropped his backpack on the sidewalk and gone toward a burning car because that was what the moment required. He wrote about what that kind of person showed you about the world simply by existing in it and acting from it. He did not name the chapter, and he did not name Marcus, and he did not name Carol. He named no one. He wrote around the specific situation the way he had learned to write around specific situations across 27 years of preaching to people who were living inside them. closely enough that everyone who needed to understand understood, and with enough space around it that the understanding felt like their own arrival rather than something handed to them. He read it back twice and made 2 small changes and put it in the drawer and closed it and sat with his hand flat on the closed drawer for a moment. He had decided to deliver it the following Sunday. He had also decided, after the Tuesday morning conversation with Danny on the sidewalk, to do one thing he had not done in the 3 weeks since the chapter began appearing on Dexter Avenue. He picked up his phone and called Carol Green and introduced himself and told her he was the pastor of the church on the corner and that he wanted to say something to her, and that the something was that he had been watching what was happening around her and her son, and that he was glad. Carol told him she appreciated that and asked if he had spoken with the chapter. He told her he had spoken with Danny and that it had been an honest conversation. Carol asked him what he had concluded from it. Aldridge told her he had concluded that honest was a reasonable place to start, and that he was watching to see what came after it, and that so far what had come after it had been consistent with what had been promised, and that consistent was the word he was using because it was accurate, and because he had learned not to reach for stronger words before they had been fully earned. Carol told him that was wise. He said he had had a long time to learn it, and wished her a good evening and hung up. Danny came to the apartment on Saturday evening. He knocked and Carol answered, and he told her the chapter wanted to take Marcus to the hospital on Monday to schedule the first treatment, and that he wanted to make sure that was how Carol wanted it to happen, or whether she wanted to take him herself. Carol looked at him and told him she was going to take Marcus herself, and that she would like Danny to be there too if he was willing. Danny told her he would be there. Carol asked him if he wanted to come in. He told her he had somewhere to be, and that he would see her Monday, and she thanked him again, and he told her not to thank him, and went back to his truck. He sat outside the building for a moment before he drove away. The street was quiet in the way of a Saturday evening in November when the cold has arrived properly and settled in for the season. The church on the corner was dark except for the light above the door, and above it, on the second floor, a single window was lit, Aldridge's office, the shape of the man visible behind the glass still at his desk, the worn leather Bible open in front of him the way it always was. Danny looked at the window for a moment and then started the truck and drove home. Reverend Aldridge delivered the sermon on Sunday morning to a congregation that filled every pew and 2 folding chairs at the back that were brought out on the Sundays when the weather was too cold for people to find reasons not to come. He stood at the pulpit in his good suit, and he opened without his usual greeting and without the scripture reading that normally preceded the sermon, because he had decided that what he was going to say did not need a running start, and that a running start would dilute it. He talked about Dexter Avenue, not about what it lacked or what it had lost or what it deserved, which were the framings he had used for 27 years with the faithful accuracy of someone reporting on conditions he could observe but could not change. He talked about what he had seen on it in the past 7 weeks. He described the accident at the intersection of Dexter and 9th Street in October without naming anyone, and his congregation knew what he was describing before he finished the first sentence, because the accident had been the subject of conversation on this street and in this building since the Thursday it happened. He described a boy who dropped his backpack and went toward a burning car, and his congregation knew who he was describing, and some of them looked at their hands in their laps, because the describing of it produced something in the chest that was difficult to sit with while looking straight ahead. Then he talked about what came after. He talked about people who arrived on Dexter Avenue and kept arriving, and who did what they said they were going to do, and who did not announce what they were doing, and who did not require observation or acknowledgement to continue doing it. He said that in 27 years he had learned to distinguish between attention and presence, and that the difference was what happened when the convenient moment to leave arrived and the person either left or stayed, and that, in his experience, most people left, and that the people standing on this street in the past 7 weeks had not left, and that he was saying this publicly because he had said the opposite publicly in this room on previous occasions, and because accuracy required him to say when he had been wrong. The congregation was quiet in the way of people receiving something that costs the person delivering it something visible, and who are acknowledging the cost by receiving it carefully. Aldridge did not rush the quiet. He let it sit for a moment, and then he said one more thing. He said that a 14-year-old boy from this street had shown everyone on it something about what a person was capable of when they did not stop to calculate the cost, and that the people who had come to this street in response to what that boy did had shown everyone on it something about what it looked like when people decided to stay, and that both of those things were true, and both of them belonged to Dexter Avenue, and that he wanted his congregation to receive them as such. He closed the Bible on the pulpit and stepped back, and his congregation sat with what he had given them, and a woman in the third pew named Dolores, who had lived on Dexter Avenue for 41 years, put her hand over her mouth and looked at the ceiling, and the man beside her put his hand over hers without looking at her. Danny was outside. Rick had called him on Saturday evening and told him that Aldridge was preaching something on Sunday that he ought to hear, and that Rick had heard about it through a member of the congregation who attended with his wife, and who had told Rick that the Reverend had been writing it for 3 weeks. Danny had arrived at the church at 10:45 and had stood outside the side door, which was propped open for the ventilation that old buildings needed, and he had listened from outside with his back against the brick wall and his arms at his sides and his eyes on the sidewalk in front of him. He listened to the whole sermon without moving. When Aldridge finished, and the congregation began the closing hymn, Danny straightened up from the wall and stood for a moment, and then walked to the front steps of the church and stood at the bottom of them. The congregation came out in the slow way of people who have been given something to think about, and who are still thinking about it, and who are not in any hurry to stop. They came past Danny, and most of them looked at him, and some of them nodded, and one older man stopped and told him good morning, and Danny told him good morning, and the man went on. Aldridge came out last. He came through the front doors and down the steps and stopped at the bottom when he saw Danny, and they looked at each other across the short distance of the bottom step. Danny told him that was an honest thing to do. Aldridge told him honesty was what the situation required, and that he had not always been as quick to recognize that as he should have been, and that he was saying so now because it was accurate and because his congregation deserved the accurate version of him rather than the defended version. Danny looked at him for a moment and then put out his hand, and Aldridge took it, and they shook hands on the bottom step of the church on Dexter Avenue in the cold November morning. And that was the whole of it, and it contained everything it needed to contain. Marcus's first treatment was on Monday morning. Carol drove and Marcus sat in the passenger seat, and they did not talk much on the way because there was not much to say that had not already been said, and because what was ahead of them was not something that words prepared you for, only the arriving at it did. Danny was in the waiting room when they got there, which Marcus had not expected, and he stood up when they came in and shook Marcus's hand and told Carol good morning, and sat back down and picked up the magazine he had been holding without reading it. Carol and Marcus went in together. The treatment was administered by a nurse named Patricia, who was matter-of-fact and specific, and who talked Marcus through each step before she did it, in the way of someone who understood that knowing what was coming was better than not knowing, even when what was coming was uncomfortable. Marcus sat in the chair with his sleeve rolled up and his hands on his knees, and his hands were not in his pockets and were not hidden in any way. And Carol sat beside him and looked at his hands on his knees, and then at his face, and Marcus looked at her, and she told him it was going to be all right, and he told her he knew. After the treatment, they sat in the waiting room for the observation period that Patricia had told them about, and Danny was still there. Marcus sat across from him, and Danny asked him how it had gone, and Marcus told him it had gone the way Patricia had described it would go, which was that it was uncomfortable but manageable, and that manageable was a word he was prepared to work with. Danny told him that was a reasonable position. Marcus looked at the waiting room and then at Danny and told him that Caleb had called him on Friday when the fundraiser reached the number. Danny said he knew. Marcus told him he had not known Caleb was watching the fundraiser every day. Danny told him that Caleb had done it because Danny had told him it was what you did when someone did something for you and you wanted to do something back, and that Caleb had taken it as instruction. Marcus looked at his hands in his lap, steady, and then at Danny, and told him that Caleb was a good kid. Danny told him he knew, and that he had some help getting there from people who had shown him what good looked like by doing it in front of him. Marcus looked at the waiting room ceiling for a moment, and then back at Danny, and said nothing. And Danny said nothing, and the waiting room was quiet around them, and the quiet was the kind that did not need filling. Carol came out of the consultation with Patricia and looked at the two of them sitting in the quiet waiting room and told Marcus they could go. Marcus stood up, and Danny stood up, and Marcus looked at Danny and told him he had a question. Danny said, "Go ahead." Marcus asked him if the Saturday morning garage sessions were going to continue after the treatment was funded. Danny looked at him and told him that Curtis would be there next Saturday, the same as every Saturday, and that the panhead was not going to rebuild itself, and that Marcus had better not leave Curtis alone with it, because Curtis's knees were a genuine problem, and because Marcus was the only one who could get to the lower components without difficulty, and that this was a practical matter and not a sentimental one. Marcus looked at him for a moment and told him he understood the distinction. Danny told him good and shook his hand and Carol's hand and watched them walk out through the waiting room doors and into the November morning and stood in the waiting room alone for a moment before he followed. Spring came to Dexter Avenue the way spring came to streets that had been waiting for it, with the specific patience of places that had learned not to expect things too early. The trees along the sidewalk put out their first leaves in the cautious way of trees on city streets that have had their roots disturbed enough times to approach new seasons carefully, and by the second week of April, the leaves were fully out and the light on Dexter Avenue in the morning was the particular green-gold light that only existed when sun came through new leaves, and that made even concrete look like it had been reconsidered. Marcus was doing better. This was not a dramatic statement, and he would not have made it dramatically. It was simply accurate in the specific way that accurate things are, verifiable in small, observable details rather than in any single declaration. His hands were steady on most days, and on the days they were not, he still did not put them in his pockets, not because the shaking had stopped mattering, but because the hiding of it had stopped being necessary. And the difference between those two things was the difference the treatment had made in the most practical sense. He walked to school on Dexter Avenue with his hands out of his pockets, and nobody who had not known him before would have noticed anything different about him, and the people who had known him before noticed everything. Carol worked one job. She had been working one job since December, and the adjustment to having evenings had taken longer than she expected because the evenings had been occupied for 8 months by the restaurant, and before that by the particular vigilance of a parent managing a situation alone, and vigilance did not simply stop when the situation changed. It took time to learn what evenings were for when they were not for working, and she learned it slowly and without announcing the learning. She cooked dinner at a pace she had not cooked at in years. She sat at the kitchen table after dinner with her tea and did not immediately stand up and go somewhere else. On Saturday mornings, she sometimes walked to the bakery on 5th Street and sat in the window with a coffee and read, which was something she had told herself she would do someday for 4 years, and which it turned out required nothing more than a Saturday morning with nothing required of it. Curtis had Marcus working on the panhead's top end by March. The primary chain was resolved and the lower engine was solid, and Marcus had moved upward through the engine with the methodical progression of someone who understood that you did not skip steps and that each step was preparation for the next, and that preparation done correctly made everything after it easier. Curtis told Danny in February that Marcus had the best mechanical instincts he had seen in a student in 20 years, and that the instincts were not teachable, which meant they were not the result of the Saturday mornings, but had been there before them, and that the Saturday mornings had simply given them somewhere to go. Danny told Curtis to tell Marcus that directly. Curtis said he had, and that Marcus had received it in the way he received most things, by looking at the engine for a moment and then asking the next question. Caleb came to Dexter Avenue on Saturdays sometimes. He and Marcus had built the specific friendship of two people whose first meeting had been extreme and who had had to construct something ordinary on top of it, which required more deliberate effort than friendships that began ordinarily and which produced something sturdier as a result. They talked about the panhead and about school and about things that had nothing to do with burning cars or fundraisers or treatments, and the talking about things that had nothing to do with those things was the most important part of what they were building. Caleb had the burn scar on his left forearm, thin and pale now, and he did not cover it and did not draw attention to it, which was the right relationship with it. The relationship of someone who has decided that a scar is information about what happened and not a definition of who you are. Reverend Aldridge had not used the word attention in a sermon since November. He had replaced it with presence in every context where he had previously used them interchangeably, and his congregation had noticed the change without commenting on it, because his congregation understood that the changes a man made in his language were his own to make, and that the right response to them was to receive the changed language and let it do its work. He had spoken to Carol 3 times since November, briefly on the sidewalk outside the church on Dexter Avenue, and he had spoken to Marcus once on a Saturday morning when Marcus was walking to the garage, and they had stood on the sidewalk for 4 minutes and talked about the panhead and about the spring semester and about nothing in particular, and when Marcus walked on, Aldridge stood on the steps and watched him go, and then went inside and sat at his desk and opened his leather Bible to no particular page and sat with it in his hands for a while. Not reading, just holding it, the way you hold something that has been with you long enough to constitute a kind of company. Danny had dinner at the Green apartment in March. Carol cooked, and the 3 of them sat at the kitchen table with the food and the evening light coming through the window and the radio on low, and the conversation moved through Marcus's school progress and the panhead's top end and Caleb's project about local history that Caleb had mentioned to Marcus and Marcus had mentioned to Danny, and which Danny had told Caleb he was interested in hearing about, which Caleb had received as instruction and which he was now preparing to deliver at length. It was an ordinary dinner in the way that things are ordinary when they have been ordinary long enough to forget they were once extraordinary. And Danny sat at the table and ate the food and listened to Marcus explain the specific problem with the panhead's rocker arms and looked at Marcus's hands moving while he talked and said nothing about them because there was nothing to say. On the last Saturday of April, Marcus sat at his desk before the garage session and looked at the desk surface and at the things on it. His school planner, a library book that Caleb had lent him, the community college brochure that Danny had left on the kitchen table in February without mentioning it, which Marcus had moved to his desk without mentioning it, which was a conversation they had been having without words for 2 months, and which Marcus had decided that morning was ready to become a conversation with words. His backpack hung on the back of his chair, the same backpack that had sat on the sidewalk of Dexter Avenue on a Thursday afternoon in October, with his name visible in the front pocket window. Carol was in the kitchen making breakfast. He could hear her moving around the kitchen at the unhurried Saturday morning pace she had developed across 4 months of having Saturday mornings, and he could smell coffee and eggs, and through the kitchen window, the sound of a motorcycle on Dexter Avenue moving south toward 9th Street was present for a moment, and then gone. He did not need to look up at the sound. He already knew who it was and where they were going, and that he would be there in an hour, and that Curtis would be at the workbench with the coffee already made and the rocker arms laid out in the order they had established for disassembly, and that the morning would go the way Saturday mornings went now, with the work and the quiet and the specific satisfaction of understanding something better at the end of it than at the beginning. He picked up the community college brochure and took it to the kitchen and set it on the table in front of his mother's chair and went to get his coffee. Carol came to the table and saw the brochure and looked at Marcus, and he looked back at her over his coffee cup, and she sat down and opened it. His hands were steady in the spring light, and that was enough. Marcus Green was 14 years old and managing a disease that cost $20,000 to treat, and walking to school every morning with his hands in his pockets so his mother would not see the shaking and worry more than she was already worrying. On a Thursday afternoon in October, he dropped his backpack on the sidewalk of Dexter Avenue and went toward a burning car because the alternative did not present itself to him as an option. He got a boy out. He checked him over. He pressed his own sleeve against the cut above the boy's eyebrow and told him he was going to be all right. And then he walked home alone and said nothing about it to anyone. He did not do it for recognition. He did not do it for reward. He did it because a boy was trapped, and he was the person standing close enough to do something about it. And that was the full extent of the calculation. There are people like Marcus on every street in this country. People managing something invisible and difficult, and doing it without complaint and without asking for anything from anyone, and who will still stop and go toward the thing that needs them, because that is simply who they are. Most of them never get found. Marcus got found. What the chapter did with finding him was not a ceremony or a gesture. It was Saturday mornings and a restructured fundraiser and a man who sat in a hospital waiting room on a Monday morning reading a magazine he was not reading because he wanted to be there when Marcus came out. That is what staying actually looks like. Not grand, just present. If this story moved you, leave a comment and tell us what part you are still thinking about. If you want more stories like this one, subscribe so you are here when the next one arrives. And if someone in your life is carrying something heavy and doing it quietly and beautifully, send this to them today. We will see you in the next one.